Uh, it is a very pleasant autumn morning. As you know, the overall theme of this track A is school education and human resource. Along this theme, the specific theme of this track A session is skill dynamics for happy education and social progress. I wish this session provide full illumination and provocative imagination to deepen our understanding and good ideas. As you know, we have two invited speakers and two discussions. I would like to introduce two speakers one by one. The first speaker is Katarzyna Kubak. She is an OECD analyst. His brief information is on your brochure, page 88. He has a PhD in social psychology at VRIJE University. Would you elaborate which means VRIJE?
It's Vrije University in Amsterdam.
I see. Now she is working at the OECD as an analyst. One of his published article is in 2011, maintaining close relationship, gratitude as a motivator and a detector of maintenance behavior, personality and social psychology bulletin. I think her presentation today may introduce emerging OECD's interesting project on the theme of education and social progress. I hope her presentation gives us good information as well, good implication for us how to understand and cooperate each other. The second speaker is Professor Kerry Roth. He is an associate professor at the Michigan State University. His brief introduction is on page 89. He has his PhD at the University of Minnesota, and now he is associate professor at Michigan State University. His recent published work is in this year, blending synchronous face-to-face and computer-supported cooperative learning in a hybrid doctoral seminar. I think his main theme is cooperation. I think cooperative attitude is very much important for mutual understanding and personal growth as well as social progress. Professor Kerry Rodas also awarded interesting things. This year, Promise Award, Conflict Resolution and Violence Prevention Special Interest Group, American Educational Research Association. In Korea, 미국 교육학교에서 수상하신 실적이 있습니다. 예. 오늘 재미있는 그 발표가 되겠습니다. These two invited speakers spent 30 minutes each and 10 minutes discussion from invited discussions. The first discussion is Dr. Misu Kim from KEDI. She is a well-known educational researcher in creativity. And the second discussion is Dr. Yoon Ye-jun. He is originally a professor of Seoul National University, and now currently he joined the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Energy for temporary cooperation. Well, from now on, I'd like to two speakers. The first speaker, Katarina Kubaka. Please give her big hand.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased and honored to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm here to present the project that I'm working on at the OECD, so Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in the Education and Skills Directorate. And the project is called Education and Social Progress. The main idea of the project is to look into how learning contexts can bring about cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and how such skills can contribute to different measures of social progress. I will explain this in more detail, but before that, I will present the background to the project, then move on to the ESP framework, and briefly describe the findings of ESP Phase 1, which is now drawing to close, which include conceptual reviews that we've commissioned and analysis of longitudinal data, including data coming from Korea. And I will conclude on our current plans for the next phase of our project, which include international longitudinal study on skills dynamics. To begin with, how does this project place in the kind of more general background of OECD work and literature? Well, it starts off with us knowing that skills matter. My colleagues yesterday, Deborah and Miho, described some of the results of the adult skills survey. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but just in general, we know also from that survey and previous research that skills matter for labor market outcomes. They went into detail about the different findings. This is just an illustration. We know that skills matter for wages, for instance. So this graph shows you that additional increase in education or increase in proficiency, in this case literacy, moving up a scale leads to increased wages. So overall, in all of our countries where we collected the data, the more educated and the more proficient, the more literate, tend to earn more. And you can see Korea is no exception in that. What is even more important for our project is that skills matter also for other outcomes. Our project is deeply rooted in the tradition of more social outcomes of learning. They matter for academic success. They matter for well-being, so both health and happiness. They matter for safety, by which we mean kind of more adult measures of safety, such as crime, but also school-level safety. So bullying, for instance, is an important subject for the OECD. And what kind of skills matter? I mean, I already mentioned literacy, which we measured in adult skills survey. But another important focus of our project are non-cognitive skills. So what we often refer to by soft skills, social-emotional skills. One of such skills is self-control. And an important or an interesting illustration of how self-control matters is a marshmallow test. And I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but I'll just briefly illustrate it. It's in a way a fun example, but it's also quite a telling one. In this test, a number of 4-year-olds were placed in a laboratory setting. Each of them separately would be put in a lab room, and in front of them there would be placed a marshmallow, so something that the kids like. It's very sugary, not very healthy, but they like it. They were told to stay in the room for about 15 minutes and refrain from eating it. And as you can imagine, I don't know, maybe some of you have 4-year-old kids, or all of us have been 4-year-old. Not many kids were able to do it. And I recommend checking the video online. They're very funny. So most kids really try to resist it and try to look away, try different strategies not to eat the marshmallow, but most of them would in the end succumb to it and eat the marshmallow. However, there's a small group that would resist it. And what is interesting is that this quite a funny test, and quite, you would think, superficial test, has been found to have some strong associations with adult outcomes. So for instance, at age 17, the kids that ate the marshmallow, that couldn't resist the temptation, have lower SAT scores than those that did resist the temptation. What is even more telling is that at age 39, those who ate the marshmallow, maybe continued to eat them, have higher BMI than those that resisted the temptation. So this, in combination with OECD work, has led to our project in a way. It's the body of work that shows that both cognitive and non-cognitive skills matter has led us to pose certain questions, which are at the core of our project. First of all, we are looking at, as I mentioned, non-cognitive ability, which I will describe in more detail in a second, and also how it relates to cognitive ability. So we're interested in the interaction between the two. And very important for us, how do the two kinds of skills lead to different measures of social and economic outcomes? We're looking at employment, health, citizenship, civic engagement, trust, safety. As I mentioned, different measures of safety, including bullying as well on the school level. And then another equally important question, especially from the OECD perspective and from policy making, is how can we nurture those skills? And here we recognize the importance of different learning contexts. So not only formal learning, which happens in school, but also informal and non-formal learning that happens both in school but also in family and community. How do different parenting styles contribute to nurturing of skills? How does pedagogy, certain use of, for instance, of teamwork in your pedagogy can contribute to the nurturing of skills? And how can peer interactions in the community, as well as media effects, how can they affect the development of skills? These are some of the questions that guide our work. So as I mentioned, we're focused on two types of skills in a broad sense. I mean, this is quite a broad definition and quite an academic one in a way. We're looking at cognitive skills, which you can think of, or normally the way they're measured would be by IQ achievement tests, literacy and numeracy, or problem-solving tests. And then non-cognitive skills, as I mentioned, are often referred to as soft skills, character skills, social-emotional skills, and personality. While there are some differences between those definitions, in this project we come to take them as a whole. And for the sake of illustration, we're putting them separately, but it's important to notice that they are in some ways connected. So there's, for instance, research showing that when we measure achievement, with achievement tests, such as even PISA or standardized tests such as SATs in the US, and I believe there are similar ones in Korea, we're measuring cognitive ability, so in a way intelligence of the children, but we're also measuring things like their motivation, their conscientiousness. For instance, the extent to which children go on with solving difficult tasks reflects both their intelligence, so to speak, but also their commitment, their motivation. So in reality, those skills often overlap, especially in the way that they're measured. What do we mean specifically when we talk about cognitive skills? For the sake of our project, we developed a framework that we believe reflects their day-to-day use, so to speak. So while the definition of cognitive skills is, as you can see, a mental capacity to acquire knowledge, thoughts, and experience, interpret, reflect, and extrapolate based on the knowledge acquired. We look into different types of cognitive skills, and we'd like to look at the effects of each of those types. So we differentiate between basic cognitive ability, so the ability to memorize, recognize patterns, the processing speed of acquiring information. Looking at knowledge acquired, access to knowledge, extracting knowledge, interpreting knowledge and facts. And then knowledge extrapolated, so ability to reason and reflect and conceptualize. And these, to some extent, are a reflection of the literature, but also a kind of a lay framework in order to guide our work and in order to also explain our work better to different audiences. Same for non-cognitive skills. The definition that we've adopted is, refers to relatively enduring patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that reflect the tendency to respond in certain ways under certain contexts. And what are the day-to-day uses of, or illustrations of non-cognitive skills? We look at achieving goals. As we know, this is something that we need throughout our life, and this can be reflected in perseverance, self-control, passion for long-term goals. So to what extent we can commit to something, resist temptation. These might not be marshmallows, but it could be watching TV instead of doing our homework, or anything that is a distraction. Working with others is another important dimension of non-cognitive skills. This could include concepts such as friendliness, respect, caring. This describes teamwork, which can happen both in school as much as at work, within family, peer groups as well. And another important dimension that we consider is managing emotions. So ability to deal with stress, to keep calm, keep optimistic, to keep confident. These all, we believe, relate to day-to-day situations and are important for everyday outcomes and life success. Now, how did we go about looking for evidence about the effects of skills on outcomes and learning context on skills? The phase 1 work has focused on determining what we know already, first of all. So what is there in the literature? We've conducted our own literature reviews as well as commissioned them, and we were honored to have Jim Heckman, who's quite advanced who was one of the most prominent economists to get interested in this kind of psychological, sociological line of work and brought it into economics. What did we find in the literature? First of all, we found that non-cognitive skills affect diverse life outcomes. So across different domains, it seems actually that non-cognitive skills matter more than cognitive skills quite often, We find that among those non-cognitive skills in the literature, conscientiousness, which you can think of as kind of discipline, orderliness, responsibility as well. Conscientiousness stands out the most. Excuse me. So yes, as I mentioned, this is described by being responsible, dependable, caring, organized, persistent. And actually, it can outperform predictive power of cognitive skills for many outcomes. In general, what we found is that in the literature, cognitive skills, so performance on achievement tests, performance on IQ tests, matters especially for labor market outcomes. So your employment, your salary. However, non-cognitive outcomes, while they do matter for labor market outcomes, they matter also for social outcomes. So your health, your well-being, in general sense, civic participation. And often they outperform cognitive skills in that domains. Another important aspect that is mentioned in the literature is malleability. And this is, in fact, when you think about it, this is why we are interested in those skills as well. Because you could think they don't change, in which case, you know, there's not really much interest in them. If this is something that you're born with, you know, tough luck. If you have low skills, good for you. If you have high skills, that's it. However, we find the evidence in the literature that those skills do change over life course. Causal evidence suggests that non-cognitive skills are malleable, just as cognitive skills. However, what is kind of advantage of non-cognitive skills, seemingly, is that while there is a limited sensitive period for cognitive skills, which is in childhood, early to late childhood, non-cognitive skills seem malleable beyond that period, which is, of course, good news for policymakers, because this is something that we can invest into in order to bring better outcomes to our children, as well as adults, actually. On the negative side, we found that the causal evidence in the literature is limited. So first of all, it's limited geographically. Most of the evidence comes from the US and the UK in the literature. And also, it's methodologically limited. So there's not that many interventions or experiments or even longitudinal studies that would help us understand the causal mechanisms. Knowing this, we set about looking for new longitudinal studies internationally which could help us understand the mechanisms of skill formation and skills effects on outcomes. And we had two criteria in general, three actually, for looking at the data. So one was we were looking for longitudinal data in order to better understand potentially the causal mechanisms of skill formation and skill effects. Secondly, we were interested in data sets that had measures of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So while our special focus is on non-cognitive skills, we are always interested in both, and we, of course, acknowledge that both are important. This is not about saying that pushing the pressure onto one set of skills, it's just to acknowledge the fact that multiple skills are important. So we needed some measures of cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Thirdly, we were interested in data that would be longitudinal, that would have measures of cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and would have measures of either learning contexts and or outcomes. While we understood that there might not be a perfect data set out there, in order to understand at least one side of the equation, we needed either outcomes or learning contexts. And actually, we found quite a number of data sets that fulfilled all these conditions across the world. And for the sake of the presentation, I will focus a little bit on the Korean data set. So the data comes from Korean Youth Panel Survey, which included respondents from multiple cohorts, but the cohort we were interested in featured children age 13 until age 19. They were assessed on an annual basis. It contains assessments of skills, context, and outcomes. Very rich data, very suitable for our purposes. It included measures of cognitive skills, which were achievement tests and grades, as well as non-cognitive skills, responsibility and locus of control. And key outcomes were smoking, drinking, depression, bullying as well. I'll present an illustration of what we found. The first outcome that I'll present is depression, and that describes incidence of depression at age 19, while the skills, which were responsibility, locus of control, and cognitive skills, were measured at age 14. Now, responsibility describes to the extent to which the person was self-assessed them as dutiful, orderly, caring about long-term goals. And we find that the higher the responsibility as assessed at age 14, the lower the probability of depression at age 19. Now, locus of control is a bit more complex. The higher levels describe the more internal locus of control. So that's attributing your success and failure internally. Kind of maybe paradoxically, we find that the more internal locus of control, the lower the probability of depression. What is interesting here is that we find that the higher cognitive skills, in this case the higher achievement tests and the higher grades, the higher actually probability of depression. And this is something that we find in different data as well. So, and it also can go for non-cognitive skills. It's not always that the higher level of skills are necessarily good for you. In this case, we're able to differentiate between the two pathways, which is education, going for tertiary education and not. And we find that the cognitive skills are especially negative, have especially negative effects on your well-being for people who went into higher education. And this might be associated with increased stress of getting into the desired college and then making it in the college as well. We've done similar analysis for alcohol use. So that describes kind of binge drinking, so abusive alcohol use, or abuse of alcohol actually, at age 19. We find, again, that responsibility is associated with kind of positive outcomes in a societal way. So the higher the responsibility, the lower the probability of alcohol abuse, actually. We don't really find any statistical effects on locus of control. But again, we find that the higher cognitive skills, the higher alcohol use. And again, we found this to go through, to have an indirect effect of cognitive skills through tertiary education. And this might to do with stress of tertiary education. This might also to do with the kind of bonding that often happens at universities where, you know, you might join a fraternity or sorority or some kind of student club, and that can be often associated with drinking alcohol. Not only in Korea, actually, but we found this in other countries as well. Across all the data sets that we've considered, we found that skills matter for employment and income, academic achievement, health, which included substance use, obesity, mental health, or BMI, I should say, not obesity, life satisfaction, civic engagement, and safety, including crime and bullying. We find that cognitive and non-cognitive skills are important across these domains, although they vary in the magnitude of their effects. And we find direct and indirect effects. So as I mentioned, some of the effects go directly through skills. So you can imagine, for instance, direct effect of cognitive skills on positive health behaviors. So in a way, if you're, so to speak, smarter, you might be able to understand your doctor's recommendation better. You might be able to understand the consequences of not following your doctor's orders better. But it could be also through education. So if you're smarter, you're more likely to go into university. At the university, you might acquire certain norms which lead you into certain behavior, which could be positive. For instance, you might be socialized into doing sports. Your fellow students jog, and so you start jogging as well. It might be also negative, like drinking alcohol, as we've seen before. So your fellow students might be going out drinking a lot. This is something that happens a lot at universities. You might start doing the same. And the same analogical mechanism can be imagined for non-cognitive skills. What we did find as a drawback of our phase 1 analysis is that even though we found a number of international data which has very rich information, and the Korean data set is a good example of a very rich data set with a big sample, multiple measures, excellent data. However, if you consider them internationally, there are quite a number of there's quite a number of diversity among them. So we have different measures of skills, outcomes, or contexts, and that makes international comparisons quite difficult. Hence, our next program of work includes a proposal for an international longitudinal study of skill dynamics. And that's a new study that we would like to launch. Our plan is to have 2 cohorts, grade 1 and grade 10 cohorts. So about 6-year-olds and 15-year-olds. We would like to have annual assessments of context, skills, and outcomes. We'd like to focus on major cities or provinces. And would like the study to last about 3 years, so at least, which would cover ideally major milestones for both cohorts. So cohort 1, that would mean moving from elementary to secondary education in most of our countries. For cohort 2, so 15-year-olds, that would mean moving from secondary to tertiary education for most of them across our countries. And we're currently starting the developmental work with the plans to start the main study in 2016. Just to briefly explain the objective, as for any longitudinal study, the idea is to look at life course development. So we'd like to trace our cohorts across the major life milestones, as you can see here. And at each of those points, of course, we have different skills levels, and we have contexts influencing those skills levels. And we are, of course, interested in the outcomes of both those skills and contexts. The richest kind of set of outcomes would be available in adulthood, of course, because we can look at labor market outcomes, health behavior, safety, civic engagement. But even before that, we are able to look at the number of social outcomes. And for instance, at younger age kids, in school age kids, there are things like participation in clubs, there are things like peer relationships, bullying, being victim of bullying, and also being the bully, and certain health behaviors like doing sports that we can look at. So to sum up my presentation, our project so far has delivered some evidence on the importance of cognitive and non-cognitive skills, in which way we contribute to the existing literature. We find that the impact is on a variety of social and economic outcomes, and we find it across a really diverse set of international data coming from different regions of the world. We did find some evidence that diverse learning contexts matter for skill development. I didn't go into detail for the sake of this presentation, but we did see evidence for the fact that for both cognitive and non-cognitive skills, it's really the family, schools, and community that need to work together to best nurture those skills, and that's very important. And our next steps are to find more evidence, to look into more detail about which particular skills matter most for which outcomes. How can we nurture these skills? So how can different stakeholders, such as parents, teachers, policymakers, contribute to nurturing these skills? And we hope that the international longitudinal study that we're proposing will help us uncover more evidence on these. Thank you very much. The work has been done together with my colleagues, and their names are mentioned here. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Katarzyna Kubacko. Her presentation, I think, is very important. Her presentation gave us some insight to investigate between and relationship between the non-cognitive skills and its educational consequence. As you know, today is Korea's national tests. Our national test is focused on only cognitive aspect. Non-cognitive aspect is also much important cognitive aspect as well. Well, let me save the time. Now I introduce Professor Kerry Rodas. Please give him a big hand.
Good morning. Thank you for coming, especially so early in the morning. My body thinks it is very late at night. So this morning I will be talking about cooperation and constructive conflict resolution. But I want to give you some background into my presentation. First, I will be talking about social emotional learning, but I think for the purposes of this morning's discussion, you can think of social emotional learning very similar to the non-cognitive skills that Dr. Kubaka was the term she was using to describe her area of interest. Psychologists often like to talk about similar things but use different names. Second, to give you some background in how I come to this topic. When I graduated from college in 1994, I worked as a teacher at a boarding school for 9 years. And at a boarding school, the teachers not only teach courses, but we also are coaches. So I would coach soccer and skiing and cycling. But I also lived in the dormitories with my students. And so I would see them literally morning until they went to bed at night, 7 days a week. And one of the things that you learn in working in a boarding school is that your students behave differently depending on when you see them during the day. So I would have students in my Spanish class who could become very frustrated, become very angry and give up, say, I can't do it. And I would say, oh, if I just had better students. But the same student I would see on the playing field playing soccer or skiing, and suddenly they would arrive early, they would be very diligent, they would be working hard, and they would overcome challenges on the soccer field. And I would say, what's going on? This is the same student. Why does he not have these skills in my classroom, but he does have these skills in the soccer field? I would see the same student then in the evening, and with some peers, he would get along beautifully, and with other peers, he would get along terribly. And so it really challenged me as a teacher because often we like to think, I need to find the best students. If I had best students, then they would be learning more. But here was the same student behaving very differently in different contexts. So then I said, what about my teaching? If I can make my class more like the soccer field, more games, more fun, then perhaps my student will be better. But there too, the student would behave differently depending on which peers were around. So if he would suddenly start playing soccer with other peers, his behavior would change. And what it brought me back to become a professor was the conclusion that it's not the student necessarily, it's not necessarily the teaching, but we can change the conditions under which the students are being asked to perform different skills. So what I hope to do this morning is to explain that idea. What does it mean to change the conditions under which students are asked to demonstrate their academic or cognitive outcomes and also their social emotional outcomes? So to begin then, what are those conditions that we would think about in helping our students to realize their potential? First, a couple of myths about what those conditions are not. The first is that individual characteristics, whether they be genius, talent, cognitive, non-cognitive skills, determine achievement and lifelong success. All of us can think of examples of very smart people who did not become successful. So it has to be something more than individual talent. It's not that individual talent doesn't matter, of course it does, but that it's not enough. The second myth is that conflict should be avoided at all times in order to maintain harmony. An alternative view is that conflict can be very constructive. It can be something that helps us think about things in new ways, and that we need to encourage new ideas, new ways of viewing things. But whether conflict results in positive or negative outcomes depends on how we resolve it. So what we're looking for then, instead of just individual characteristics, are cooperative conditions that may determine these academic and lifelong success, and that we should encourage conflicts, but encourage them to be resolved constructively. So how do we do that? First, the first myth, individual talent. So the United States, of course, is very famous for our myth of the rugged individual, the self-starter, the cowboy. who meets his challenges and overcomes adversity. So we have our heroes who found Facebook or found Google or found these different institutions, and we assume, of course, that the success reflects that individual genius. Two examples that come to mind for me, of course, is the Walt Disney movie Snow White and many that followed. Walt Disney receives all the credit for the genius of Snow White, but there were over 750 artists that worked in developing Snow White. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, again, Michelangelo given all the credit, and certainly no one can dispute his genius. But little do we know that there were 14 painters in all that were working with him to complete the Sistine Chapel. So my suggestion is that the myth that it's not individual talent that's enough, that they also have to have these capacities to work constructively with others. So I'm going to focus on social emotional learning, and again, I believe that you can think of social emotional learning very similar to the non-cognitive skills that Dr. Kubaka was describing. So I describe social emotional learning as being able to recognize and manage our emotions, the ability to establish positive relationships, and to solve social problems. And as Dr. Kubaka showed, social emotional or non-cognitive outcomes are associated with a host of positive outcomes, whether it's increased academic achievement, increased academic motivation, or more positive behaviors, including pro-social behavior, and also negative behaviors. So we see fewer absences, less disruptive behavior, less aggression, etc. So some of the controversies about social emotional learning, and I will not be able to resolve these controversies today, but some of the ways that we debate these issues in academia. First, are social emotional competencies traits? That is, they're stable characteristics that students bring to diverse situations. This was my original thinking as a beginning teacher in 1994. Oh, there are some good students and some not so good students. The alternative view is that social emotional learning can be a state, and so whether the students demonstrate those competencies or not depends on the situations that they find themselves. So that's my example of being both a teacher and a coach and a dorm parent and seeing the students behave very differently in those different contexts. Two other controversies is how do we teach these competencies? Are they taught? Do students practice them? Are they reinforced? Do we use extrinsic rewards to motivate and to condition learning? Or are they caught? Do students pick them up in the context of the environment in which they're working, especially caring, supportive, well-managed learning environments? Truth be told, what psychological research suggests is that all four of these different categories, there's evidence in support of all four of them. Today, what I'd like to emphasize is both the state approach, that is, we can change conditions and change behaviors, but also the idea that what it means for these competencies to be caught. That is, how do we create environments that are caring, supportive, and well-managed, is often considered very fuzzy. It sounds good, but how do I do it? And what we know is that there are very clear guidelines to create these conditions. So what are those conditions that enhance social emotional learning? First, we know a little bit about what they're not. You cannot practice social emotional competencies, that is the ability to recognize emotions, the ability to establish positive relationships, and the ability to solve social problems if you're working alone, if you're isolated. So if I set my students up in rows and I give them worksheets to work on or a computer to work on, there is no opportunity to practice social emotional competencies. By definition, they involve working with others. Second, we also know that social emotional learning does not occur when students are competing against each other, and I show you overwhelming evidence to this degree. But competition in itself brings about different types of behaviors. So instead, the argument is made that social emotional learning requires that we create cooperative conditions for our students to work and learn, but then also that we give them the skill and opportunity to practice resolving conflicts constructively. So a little bit of background on this. So when I talk about cooperation, I'm guided by a theory called social interdependence theory, which is the basic idea that cooperation is the conditions in which our goals are positively interdependent. That is, we sink or swim together. That I can't be successful unless you are successful, and you can't be successful unless I'm successful. Often teachers, and frankly in business that I work with sometimes, they ask people to work in groups, but they do not create the conditions in which they are working cooperatively. They say work together, and the students or the employees say to themselves, I could do this myself. I don't need you. Or the teacher or manager says, go work together, and the students say, you do the work, and I'll take the credit. So cooperation is different than working in a group. Cooperation is when my success depends on your success, and when your success depends on my success. It's very fragile. Individuals have to perceive that level of, again, positive interdependence, that we sink or swim together. When those conditions are met, what we know is that our behavior changes. We engage in what we call promotive interaction patterns. That is, if my success depends on your success, then I'm much more likely to help you. I'm much more likely to share information. I'm much more likely to encourage you, to motivate you, to hold you accountable for what you are working on. Why? Because I need you. My success depends on your success. And of course, this works in the opposite direction. And so for social emotional learning, it means if I'm getting angry and frustrated, I probably don't want to lose my temper because it makes it less likely that you and I will be successful. And so just like my student behaves differently on the soccer field under these conditions, suddenly I manage those emotions in my relationships differently because to achieve my goal. So what the research looks like is that we see increases under these conditions in achievement, increases in peer relationships, that is positive peer relationships, increased motivation, and increased engagement. So let me show you some of that research. So I'll try to avoid statistical jargon here. But what you're looking at is the results of what's called a meta-analysis, or a study of studies. So whereas one study will bring in a group of participants and say have a sample size of 30, 40, 50 students, the data that you're looking at reflects 148 studies from 11 different countries, representing over 17,000 students. Arguably very generalizable compared to any one individual study. And what we see when we compare the effect sizes or the impact of different conditions, so cooperation versus competition, in terms of achievement, is associated with almost a half a standard deviation increase in achievement. And when we remove the low quality studies, that is those studies who don't do things like random assignment and controlling for teacher effects and so forth, the effect size is actually increased to 0.57. When we compare cooperative work with individualistic work, students working alone, the effect sizes on achievement increase even more, 0.55, and with low quality studies removed to 0.6, 0.67, 0.65, excuse me. On the bottom, when you look at the effect on positive peer relationships, again, you see cooperation compared to competition associated with a half a standard deviation increase, compared to individualistic work with almost a half a standard deviation as well. Here's the important part of this study when we conducted it. Sometimes when we think about peers, and especially early adolescence or middle school, students ages 11 to 15 or so, we think they need to spend more time on their schoolwork and less time on their friends. So you say, stop talking with your friends, stop hanging out, stop thinking about texting, whatever you're doing, because you should be working on your studies. And so what we were interested in, can we create the conditions in which we help students develop positive peer relationships, but in turn, they are also improving their academic achievement. And what we see here is a correlation coefficient of 0.57. The highest is 1, the lowest is 0, that's 0.57. And when you remove the low-quality studies, 0.63. In my world, correlations of this size this is extraordinarily strong. More recent work, and this is unpublished work that's currently under review. We wanted to focus on motivation. So what are the conditions under which students become more motivated to achieve those goals? So we looked at motivation both as an aggregate construct or as a summary, and we also divided it into what we called expectancy, value, and engagement. Expectancy refers to cognitive appraisals of how likely am I able to achieve this skill. So for example, I might say when I look at a math problem, oh, I can't do it. That would be a low level of expectancy. On the contrast, if I look at the math problem and say, ah, yes, I can do this, that would be a high level of expectancy. When we look at cooperation versus competition, students are much more likely a level of 0.33 to increase their view of being able to accomplish their goal. That is, they expect to be successful. And again, compared to working alone, the effect is a 0.37, so about a third of a standard deviation. When we look at value, that is, do they want to do it? Are they interested? Is this something that they want to accomplish? Again, we see increases in how much they want to accomplish these goals. Again, at the level of 0.38, 0.29, about a third of a standard deviation. And then levels of engagement. When we observe the students, how do we observe them actively working on the task as opposed to being distracted or engaged in other things? And we see, again, corresponding increases when we compare cooperation versus competition and individualism. Before I talk about these correlations, I want to emphasize that when I say cooperation, I am not saying students working in groups. I am saying creating conditions when students' success depends on others being successful. Something that requires very specific efforts to create that situation. But when that happens, amazing results come out. So the other part we looked at was the relationship between these changes in motivation and achievement. Often we have a situation where we have highly motivated individuals, but they don't achieve. Similarly, we can have unmotivated people who achieve anyway. And as someone who tries to work very hard, they are very frustrating for me because I say to myself, I worked so hard and you did nothing and you achieved. So how do we create the conditions where motivation is associated with increases in achievement? And again, we see correlations of 0.49, 0.41, 0.54. Again, in psychological research, these are very strong correlations. So to summarize, if students cannot learn their social and emotional skills, their non-cognitive skills working alone, we can't put them on a computer, we can't give them worksheets, then we have to think about creating the conditions under which they can develop those competencies. When they do, they engage in different ways of interacting with each other than they do when they're working competitively or individualistically. Under cooperative conditions, we help, we share information, we encourage. Under competitive conditions, I hide information, I don't help you. Maybe I get in the way of your success. I try to sabotage your success. Working individually, I don't care if you're successful or not. I'm working by myself. When we compare cooperation to competition individualistic conditions, we see increases in all of these outcomes. That is, we see the increased ability to engage in those non-cognitive skills. So what makes cooperation efforts more successful than others? Again, it's a very fragile idea. We don't think that it's easy to create these cooperative conditions, and we know that ineffective cooperation is that when we have what we call social loafing. That is, we let someone else do all the work. Cooperation isn't successful when someone else allows someone else to do all the work. So you need to have not only that we succeed or fail, my success depends on your success, but there also has to be individual accountability. So when I work with teachers or people in business, there can't be just one outcome for the group. Obviously, you can have one outcome for the group, but you also need to know what did the individuals contribute to that outcome. You have to have that accountability. Some of the other things we know is that when there's no reflection, often when we're working with others towards a project, it goes in stages. And there are often ups and downs. Some days are good, some days are not good. And there needs to be reflection through that process about what is working, what isn't working. When there is processing about how the group is working, then we see more effective cooperation. One of the areas that I'm working on now that I won't talk about today is this research is almost entirely based on face-to-face studies. And so one of the things that, of course, moving into the 21st century is we do a lot of our work now online over great deals of distance. We work asynchronously. And what we're doing is trying to understand whether these processes change as a result of working in online conditions. So the second myth. If the first myth was that success depends on individual characteristics, and I suggest that it does, but you also have to have these cooperative social emotional competencies. The second myth is that we want to avoid conflict when we're working with others. That destroys the harmony. When you work cooperatively, conflicts are inevitable. Just ask my wife. But those conflicts that we have, when they are managed constructively, can actually increase our ability to work together. We learn from those conflicts. We learn what not to do, and we learn what to do more effectively. So what matters then is how to create the conditions when conflict can be constructive instead of destructive. So what do I mean by constructive? I mean constructive is when joint outcomes are maximized. So my wife's example, when she's happy and I'm happy, not just when I'm happy or just when she's happy. Constructive means that we have to have a joint outcome that we agree on. And second, that it enhances our skills. So it enhances those social emotional competencies, so when we have a future conflict, that we are more likely to resolve it constructively. It is not as, the conflict is less destructive than it was in the past. So what encourages constructive conflict resolution? First, students need the ability to understand what is and what isn't a conflict. So this is the idea that sometimes we think we disagree, but actually we might agree, but we are disagreeing about things unrelated to the conflict itself. So my favorite example is working with my children. And I say, you need to go to bed. And they say, no, I don't want to go to bed. And so we have a conflict. I want them to go to bed, and they don't want to go to bed. And I'm very upset because I think you're not listening to me. This is disrespectful. You need to go to bed. And then suddenly my youngest says, no, Dad, I need to talk to you about what happened during the day. And then I feel terrible. But the point being that I thought we had a conflict, and it's true, he doesn't want to go to bed. But when we understand the reason for him not wanting to go to bed, then suddenly our goals align again, and I say to myself, oh, of course, we should talk about that. That's different than when he says, I want to watch TV, that's why I don't want it to go to bed. Then we do have a conflict. But so really getting at the root of what is and what isn't a conflict. And then the second piece is how to resolve it constructively. You have to create a cooperative context. That is, we have to create a joint outcome that we both are happy with. So I'm going to give you some examples of some interventions that have been developed and have almost 3 decades of research supporting their outcomes. The first is constructive controversy, and the second is teaching students to be peacemakers. Constructive controversy is a 5-step procedure that has been used in elementary school students all the way up through university. But what we do is we randomly assign students to opposing positions on an issue. So I might randomly assign students to the idea that all students should be given a laptop computer in school. And students would develop an argument in favor of that view. But I would randomly assign other students to the idea that no, it's not necessary to give every student a computer when they get to school. Then they move through the procedure in 5 steps where they prepare their argument, but then they meet someone who has been assigned the opposite position, and they engage in a structured controversy. A structured controversy means I present my view uninterrupted, then you present your view uninterrupted. Then we have open debate where we argue about the logic, the strength of your evidence, etc. But then importantly, in step 4, we reverse perspectives. So when I do it in face-to-face classrooms, I ask my students to get up and to switch chairs so that they literally see the world from the other side's perspective. And the goal there is to say, my understanding of your view is. Finally, in step 5, they drop all advocacy, and they say, instead of my position is, now we create the cooperative context, and they say, our position is. And that's what they have to hand in at the end of class. So what we see when students engage in this process is compared to other forms of debating ideas. So concurrent seeking. I tell the group to go, you guys need to work this out, find something you can agree on. Going through the structured controversy is associated, again, with extraordinarily large effect sizes, ranging from 0.70 and so forth on a variety of outcomes, including both cognitive and non-cognitive. When we compare constructive controversy to debate, debate is a situation where there's a winner and there's a loser. Again, we see increases in both cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes. And then finally, constructive controversy compared to students working alone. What do you think? There's different views, work on this alone. Again, moving through the structured controversy with others associated with a host of positive outcomes. Teaching students to be peacemakers is a different intervention focused on, not in the classroom, but the inevitability of there being conflicts in social situations. So when that happens, when there's an argument on the playground, when there's an argument in the hallways, when there's situations of bullying and so forth, what the research on students, teaching students to be peacemakers has looked at is helping students develop the skills to create integrative negotiations. So we help them develop the ability to describe what they want and describe how they feel. This is the goal of defining what is and what isn't a conflict. Here's what I want and here's how I feel. Then you have to give a reason for that. Then importantly, learning to take the other person's perspective, and then together forming at least 3 possible ways that you can resolve the conflict. Then together, you choose one of those plans that you both can agree on. So our hope, and again, there's approximately 10 years of research showing the efficacy of this intervention compared to just letting students work it out and learn on their own. That they develop these skills. When they're having an argument, what you hear is, listen, what I want is this, and you're making me feel this way. And then the most important part from my perspective is we hear this part. So my understanding of what you want is, you hear students engaged in perspective taking. I think this is something that all of us can learn in our own relationships. Then you see what we call divergent thinking. That is, before just agreeing on something, they have to come up with 3 options. Because sometimes when you just go to one option, you're too quick. You want to think multiple options and then choose the best one. So here's some of the data on that. Again, a host of cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes, academic achievement, the strategy use, positive attitudes, the quality of the solutions, and we see major large positive effect sizes. So to summarize, the argument that social emotional learning, that is the non-cognitive skills that we need our students to be successful in life, that they can't just depend on their individual strengths, that there also has to be this ability to recognize and manage their emotions, to establish positive relationships, and the ability to solve social problems. If we want them to learn those competencies, then we can't have them alone working on sheets and worksheets and computers alone in the classroom. We need them to work together cooperatively, but working cooperatively is very fragile. It doesn't mean working in groups. It means creating the conditions where their success depends on others' success, and that there's things like individual accountability and group processing and so forth. But then we also have to give the students the capacity to resolve the inevitable conflicts that when we work together towards a shared goal, there will be times when we don't agree on what we should do and how we feel about it. And when that happens, we need to have the skills to resolve those conflicts constructively. And that conflict in that way is not the enemy of harmony, but can actually strengthen harmonious relations because it gives us the ability to handle future conflicts more constructively. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rojas. His presentation is very much interesting, and not only for the student who look for meaningful theme for academic research, but also very much relevant in our school situation where competition is pretty much dominated. I'd like to invite two discussions. The first discussion will be made by Dr. Kim Mi-suk. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Kwak. I'm very excited to be here. As a researcher who is in charge of the Korean ESP research in KEDI, I deeply appreciate this opportunity to discuss about the issues around the OECD ESP project and also the relating issues in social emotional learning. The two excellent presentations are very timely and very informative. In terms of the policy concerns in Korea, as the Korean Ministry of Education keeps emphasizing character education, 인성교육 in Korean, in order to reduce the school violence, which becomes more and more problematic in many Korean schools throughout the country. And another reason why I think these presentations are timely is that the Korean government also puts every effort to increase the level of happiness of all Korean people, including all the students of all ages, whether they are in school or at home. So now they call it happy education or 행복교육 in Korean, and they are making every effort to implement this in their lives. However, happiness or well-being is kind of a hot issue, not just in Korea, but also in many other countries across the world. We see this in this OECD ESP project. It is considered as an important indicator of social progress beyond economic development of a society or a country. Happiness or well-being concerns both physical and psychological conditions such as health and emotional depression. That's why I believe the ESP project and the SEL, social emotional learning research, deal with the variables like drinking and smoking and cooperation and conflicts. I see a big shift in global interest from economic growth to social progress in evaluating the level of development of a country, which may be characterized as a shift from quantity matters to quality matters. So more and more countries focus on happiness, well-being, and health, and so on, and not just on GDP. So now let me point out some specific issues I believe that were raised by these very interesting presentations. And later on, I will try to make some comments on them. The first issue raised in these presentations, they identified some of the interesting variables regarding skills, either cognitive or non-cognitive skills, and learning contexts, and outcome variables. And number two, they showed us the dynamic relationship existing among these variables. Number three, the importance of non-cognitive skills were highlighted. Number four, non-cognitive skills change over time, as well as cognitive skills. Number five, non-cognitive skills can be measured. Number six, non-cognitive skills can be learned. So regarding these points, my first comment is about the dynamics of causal relationship that changes over time. The interest of the speakers centered largely around the three big variables I just mentioned: learning context, skills, and the outcome variables of performance and social progress. For example, both speakers showed us how the social, emotional, or non-cognitive skills can be enhanced by certain contexts, and how those skills can influence the academic achievements, motivation, peer relations, as presented by Dr. Rajev, and healthy lifestyle and depression, as presented by Dr. Kubacka. Especially, Dr. Kubacka showed that how the cognitive skills in time 1 influence the cognitive and non-cognitive skills in time 2, as you saw in her marshmallow experiments, and how the contexts intervene through this process of developing skills, as Dr. Rajev also stressed the importance of context, like cooperative environment, beyond individual characteristics, such as genius and talents. So Dr. Kubacka pointed out that the dynamics of relationship existed among the three variables of skills, context, and social progress. And this is very interesting to observe. But as you pointed out at the end, as she pointed out at the end, we need to probe further which skills would matter most, and in what time of the lifespan, and how would the results differ across the country. We need to calculate the unique contributions of each skill in each participating country over a long period of time. This will be a rare database, which is longitudinal and international in essence, and will enable us to better understand how a particular skill is formed in different contexts or societies, and it will enable us to specify the nature of dynamic relationship among certain variables. Another thing is about the importance of non-cognitive skills, such as responsibility and locus of control, or the social emotional learning that helps managing emotions and conflicts. I guess these two entities, non-cognitive skills and social emotional skills, are basically the same. And this has already been confirmed by Dr. Rajesh as he presented it. Even though I strongly agree with this idea, but still, cognitive skills do matter, and there's no doubt about it. For example, the higher cognitive skills were related to a higher level of depression, as you saw from the slide of Dr. Rajev. And, oh no, I'm sorry, by Dr. Kubacka. And she said that it might be because of high stress to learn more, to study harder. Then I think this means non-cognitive skills are mediating the causal relationship skills between cognitive skills and depression. So again, we need to pinpoint down the details of the active interactions between the cognitive and non-cognitive skills and the nature of the dynamics taking place in different contexts across lifetime, that is, throughout human development. The third comment is about measurement. Even if we agree that we can measure non-cognitive skills, the issue of proper and accurate measurement still remains. Are there enough measures ready to be selected for use in the literature? Whether we use some existing instruments or develop new ones, we have to make sure the validity and reliability of the instruments and should be checked out across the culture and across all age groups. If the ESP project claims to be an international and longitudinal study. Finally, I have two questions. The first one is about the term skill. The term skill, whether it is used either in non-cognitive skill or in social-emotional skill, it can be misleading. The traditional definition of the term skill, as in the Webster Dictionary, is the ability to do something that comes from training, experience, or practice, or a learned power of doing something competently, a developed aptitude or ability. So as we see here, the components of skill include the aspects of training, learning, and developing. Then, do you think, I'm addressing this question to the speakers, so then do you think that the distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive skills do really exist in reality? Or is the divide fictional and exists only for academic purpose? Worse, are we making a conceptual war between cognitive and non-cognitive skills? Let's think about this. Since the main theme of this forum is beyond words, what do your empirical data tell us about this separation? My second question is, if we accept that students can learn social emotional skills, because many studies in the literature say that they are malleable, this means that we can educate or at least help students learn these things, such as being responsible or creating cooperative environment. Okay? Then how can we apply these findings to helping students in a real classroom situation to improve their social emotional skills? How should we approach in terms of teaching materials, instructional strategies, and the evaluation of the effectiveness of teaching? What kind of advice or tips would you like to make for Korean school teachers? So that's my observation of these excellent presentations. I enjoyed learning much, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kam. Next discuss will be made Professor Yoon Yeojun.
Okay, my name is Yoo Jun-yoon, currently working for Managing Director of Strategic R&D Planning on behalf of Ministry of Industry and Trade and Energy. Before I joined this job, I have been a professor for Seoul National University for 20 years. I'm an engineer by training. And before I joined, I served as a president of Advanced Institute of Convergence Technology. You mean creating new technology by converging different disciplines. Well, as a president of AICT for 2 years, I realized that people, especially Korean people, tends to work alone. They are not well trained to work together, and they tends to work alone. And then sometimes I encourage them to work together because in order to create something new. We have to meet each other and we work together. But the languages of different disciplines are totally different. Okay? So I promote circumstances to mingle people together. But I found it was really a tough job. As a professor, I often interact with other people and I co-work with other professors. So in that case, I share ideas with different people. But the actual workforce of collaborative research is the graduate student themselves. So I first talk to professor and then decide to work together. And then the actual workforce is them, students. So I let them work together. But I often found that they are very lack in communication skills. And they even tend to hate each other. And they became to blame each other. So from my learning today is that the non-cognitive skills can be learned by some system. So if the non-cognitive skill, as two speakers mentioned, is very important in happiness and social achievement, if such non-cognitive skills can be learned somehow during the early stage of their the education, we probably have a better society. One case I recently have with a student. He graduated from my lab about 10 years ago. He joined a big conglomerate, and then he suddenly gave me a call, and then he come to my office. He is a very, very excellent researcher. He did a lot of good work at school, at even a company. But he was a little shy guy, and then he had many conflict with his peers, and then he decided to not to have a conflict with them, and then gradually he lose chances of promotion. So from their research, I found that there are certain ways to constructively solve the conflicts. But I found that a lot of Korean youngsters were not well trained how to resolve such issues, and then they just decide to keep silent, something like that. So I definitely found that the research done by two researchers are very, very informative, and they such kind of the attitude should be included in the curriculum, especially in early stage of education, and especially those who are very good at mathematics and science and engineering. Those students tend to believe in their capabilities, and they believe that the success depends on themselves. But there are a lot of other things that we should work together. So those kind of spirit, teamwork, must be included very carefully in the new set of curriculums. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yoon. We have about 6 minutes left, but I would like to extend our discussion time 10 more minutes if you participate in. I will give a final reaction to the speakers. Before that, I'd like to invite some of you, if you have any question or comments, please hands up. Well, please, in the center, okay.
Thank you. I wanted to propose a question to the...
Please name and your affiliation.
Sorry. My name is Kim Hae-soo, and I am a part of Postec Gifted Institute for Creative Entrepreneurs. And, well, I wanted to propose a question to both of the speakers, if you don't mind. You both talked about non-cognitive skills and socio-emotional education, and while I do believe that's important, and this is me talking as a high school student in Korea, it's not like we completely lack such education. It's just that it's not very effective right now. It's kind of theoretical, and it's not being applied effectively, again. So I know you proposed that it should be applied in the, what do you say, in the situations, but then it's, as I said, it's not being effectively applied right now. I wanted to know how you think about these situations and how it could be effectively applied.
Okay, thank you. One more. Okay. The behind, okay.
Good morning. My name is Ian Batiste. I'm a speaker here. I hail from the Caribbean.
Name?
Ian Batiste.
From?
Grenada in the Caribbean.
Brunei?
Grenada in the Caribbean.
Okay, please.
It's a long way, 22 hours away.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
I am a teacher. And so when I hear about the possibility of having cooperative efforts that can have individual contributions assessed, I'm really excited about this idea. And so you have any examples, because I can't find very good ones, frankly. Do you have any good examples of cooperative efforts with individual contributions? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anyone? Okay, please.
Hi, I'm Mike Osborne from University of Glasgow, and I'd just like to emphasize what Ian just said there. All too often in universities we talk about using alternative methods of assessment, and all the time we're being told to use innovations.
Please louder.
All the time we're being told to use innovations, particularly peer-grouped assessment, and when you do peer-grouped assessment, how do you practically measure the contribution of individuals? And a second point, which strikes me, is that so much of this work that Carrie was talking about from the psychological domain doesn't seem to find its way into teacher training. That particularly seems to be the case to me in the UK. And in fact, it's not only work from the psychological domain, it's work from the biological domain as well. All the work, for instance, that OECD has done on brain research, I don't see it being translated into practice in terms of the way in which our teachers are trained. And I'd invite both speakers to make comments on that.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to stop due to the time limitation. Okay. Well, you may have a final reaction, questions raised by Dr. Kim and floor comments. 2 minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll start with questions from the discussants. Thank you very much for all the questions. They were very interesting and very thought-provoking, I think. Dr. Kim mentioned that happiness is a goal in education, and I think this we all understand, at least working for the OECD, most of our countries are now moving beyond just economic outcomes. I think you can see this everywhere internationally, at least in middle to high income countries. The question was about the differentiation between cognitive and non-cognitive skills and to what extent that's maybe artificial. As I mentioned in the presentation, at least in the way we measure skills at the moment, they are quite blurred. So especially when you think about achievement tests, which are across all countries the main point of making both teachers and students accountable. We think of them really as a measure of cognitive tests, cognitive skills, but to some extent they also reflect non-cognitive skills, and I already mentioned that. And I think an important part here is not to put them in contrast. I think that was a good point that Dr. Kim made, and I agree. We should, I think, consider them together. They're both important, and we see from all the data that they both matter, sometimes in a positive, sometimes in a negative way, but in any case, they matter. And we're educating individuals and not just parts of individuals, and I think that relates also to the teaching. I'm trying to be fast and answer as much as I can. We know that they can be learned. That's not to say that I think that they can be learned easily. Training is a long-term process. I think about real classroom situations and advice for teachers, some of what we've seen in the interventions that seem to have worked was involving also parents. So I think that's important to consider all the different learning contexts together. It's not just, I think sometimes when we speak to teacher unions, they might take it as an additional burden where it shouldn't be. I think teaching, and that was mentioned in one of the questions, most of the curricula already have the non-cognitive aspects in them, and actually they're often much more emphasized than the cognitive aspects. So if you look through international curricula, you will always have something about educating responsible, conscientious, committed individuals, which is really social emotional learning or non-cognitive skills. But the question is how to do it in classrooms, and I think Carrie will have more to say about cooperation. Some of the intervention that worked, other than involving parents, is also to make it kind of an explicit goal in terms of teaching, so you do pay attention to it as much as just transferring knowledge. I think that's something that maybe is missing, also partly because of the pressure that teachers receive for just kind of progressing with the cognitive outcomes, as we call them. Another thing that seems to be working, especially with disadvantaged groups, is to consider the context of their learning. They tend to have much more stress coming into the classroom, and so what we've seen to work is to kind of acknowledge the stress that the students come into the classroom with and try to first address that before they can actually acquire knowledge. Yeah, and learning by doing, so putting people on project-based learning, teamwork, but I think that's something Carrie can speak more to. Peer group, how does it translate into teacher training? I think this is a very good question. I'm not sure if I'm in the best position to answer it. We do hear from teachers that it doesn't. I think from what I've seen is that, I mean, there's more, individual teachers seem to be, that I've met, seem to be very committed to introduce those methods. Perhaps part of the problem is also with the whole system as such and the accountability mechanisms, I think. There's, in my opinion, perhaps too much stress put only on the cognitive aspects in terms of accountability. And that brings with it the kind of often too much emphasis on only the cognitive aspects in terms of practice of teaching. I think the way it can be addressed, I hope at least, is part of the OECD work, and we're trying to address those aspects, and I think we're in a position to talk to different stakeholders. It seems to me like it needs to be a system-wide change. It cannot just be the teachers saying this is important or students, but you know, that needs to come from different stakeholders. But the exact mechanism is not something that I can unfortunately advance, I'm afraid. I think that's it for me, because we don't have much time.
Thank you. Well, Professor Rojaf.
Yes, thank you for your questions and for the excellent discussion points as well. I would just to echo Dr. Kubacka's comment regarding the distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive skills. Without going into too much detail, that distinction reflects very much an historical tradition within psychology that the evidence increasingly suggests is not appropriate. That is, we make rational decisions also based on instinctive or gut influences about what we should decide. And so what we think of historically as existing only in the prefrontal cortex, we now know is heavily influenced by the limbic system and other what we consider older emotional parts of the brain. And so everything from, with increasing evidence, we're realizing that we really are a whole person. We can't divide ourselves into these different parts. And so it's a very interesting area of work. To speak to the questions about application, the first is I want to emphasize how do we apply and so forth. As a skill, I would emphasize two things. One, sometimes the term skill is always considered in a positive light, in that when we aren't working cooperatively, for example, the opposite of that is where we work alone or we work competitively, that would be a lack of skill. And I think an important idea for teachers and for managers and the like is to recognize that working competitively might also be a skill, as can be working alone. The problem is the mismatch. So when I have to work cooperatively, bringing the wrong skill set to that problem. And so to characterize, we think about these things in terms of bullying as well. Bullying can be a very effective way to increase your social status. A terribly, terribly awful way for the victims of bullying. But nonetheless, in terms of the goal of status within a peer group, it can achieve that goal. And so not always assuming the negative or positive connotations with skills, but sometimes students have to unlearn ways that they've learned to solve problems, I think is a key idea. The other thing in terms of how do we apply this across the lifespan is I would emphasize that it is a lifespan development. The skills that you were successful for me in university are not necessarily the same skill set that I need to be successful as a professor, in my marriage, in my community work, or what have you. And so we like to think of social and emotional skills in terms of their isolated pieces, but it may be that the implementation of those skills vary depending on where we are, both situationally and in our lifespan. So it's something that I really consider there's continued learning going on under all conditions. Some good examples of how does this work. So I'll give you two examples. One of my favorite ways of implementing cooperative structures in classrooms is what we call a jigsaw technique. Jigsaw referring to puzzle pieces, where, for example, we'll have students divide up an assignment. So I will do problem 1, you do problem 2, and you do problem 3. But at the end, we have to take a quiz based on what we were supposed to learn in all 3 of those problems. So the key idea here is that we learn together, but we perform and the quiz alone at the end. So I'll say that again. We learn together, but we perform alone. The way the jigsaw procedure works is that because I have problem 1, but you need to know the information I have, you really are interested when I try to teach you problem 1. And you have problem 2, but I need it because I need to learn that for the quiz. I depend on you teaching me number 2 well. And finally, the person who has number 3, I need to listen, and they need to do a good job, but they also need to make sure that the 2 of us do a good job on ours because she's going to be performing alone on that quiz. So there's an example where my success depends on the other 2 people being successful, and their success depends on mine. But the learning happens together. The performing on the final assessment happens alone. So multiple levels of individual accountability. The other example I'll use is what's called paired maths, which is actually a government-sponsored study in the UK that I've been working on with professors at the University of Dundee and now at Queen's University in Ireland. But paired maths is an idea of working together in groups of 2, where again, I'm working on one problem, and the teacher has given us strategies to work through the problem, and the student's job is to make sure I'm doing those strategies. So I'm doing something, and the peer is watching me and says, oh, you forgot to do this. And I go, oh, yes. So the idea is that your peer is helping you remember something about solving the problem that sometimes we can forget because we're overwhelmed by the complexity of the math problem. But then we switch, and it's your turn to solve the problem, and I watch you do it and make sure that you're doing the steps correctly. So from a cognitive perspective, it's the opportunity to offload some of the work of remembering how to do something while we try to figure something out. So those are 2 examples. As to the teacher training piece, and then I'll stop. All of us went to school. And so one of the challenges with teachers and teacher education is because all of us spent 12, 14, 20 years in school, we all think we're expert teachers. We have 20 years of experience on the other side, so we can do this. And the truth is that teaching is very difficult, as we all know. But when we engage in it, we tend to assume that it worked for me, so I'm going to do the same way that I was always taught. So because teaching historically has been we're going to pour information into our students' heads rather than create the conditions where students learn and construct knowledge, we can fall back on old habits that we observed for 14, 18, 20 some years. It's hard to unlearn that, really hard. The other is that when, if you just look at what we're doing now, I'm speaking, you're listening, human beings can learn by listening. We do. We can learn just by listening. We can also learn just by watching. But what we know for education is that we don't learn as well. But when you're forced as a teacher for time, and you're forced to do lots of things in your day, just telling is the easiest. It's the most time efficient, but it's the easiest for the teacher, not the student. So it is very difficult to help teachers not only unlearn what they learn, but also how to not do what comes easiest under given circumstances. And then to finish, when you say, okay, to work together, it's also easiest to say, you guys work on that together. But again, working together is not the same thing as working cooperatively. And so really understanding how to create conditions where success depends on other people's success is hard work and requires very focused training. The good news is that we know the motivation study that I showed you was 652 studies, 27 countries, 52,000 students. We know it works. Those are non-random outcomes. But your question about training is the key one. That's where we have to go next. It's no longer, I think, meaningful from my perspective to ask if it works. It's how did we train people to do it effectively. So, again, thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Well, I want to give them 2 more times because they are very, very much distinguished experts in their field from long distance. But as you know, we live in a limited time. We are closing this session, but I'd like to mention one thing as a presider. All the Koreans here, we know well, our high school student is very competitive in international achievement tests like PISA and TIMSS. They are in the top ranks in science, mathematics, etc. But we know well, even with their highest achievement, they don't like science or mathematics. They're unhappy. That's why the topic in our session, non-cognitive aspects in education, is very, very much important for us. 2 speakers' presentation, in that sense, give us very, very much meaningful suggestion, solution, future agenda for us, what we do. Thank you very much.